I had the unenviable task of interviewing Dan and Norman this afternoon, and I've been asked or tasked with telling you the agenda for the day. I'll need glasses to do that. First, after this conversation, we'll have a session on how research can inform policy and practice in the real world, followed by a poster session, which will hopefully bring that alive. And I want to use a term from my younger colleagues, give a shout out to the GSS Data Explorer, which is a collaboration between the GSS and a team that I worked with. They'll have a demonstration on the other side. After that, there is a final session that'll look at the future of research practice, content, and delivery. So let me just start with a few remarks, and then we are going to do Oprah style to keep you entertained. I promise not to change costumes midway, but you never know. In preparation for this session, I had the great good fortune of having a couple of hours of conversation with Norman and Dan. And so what we're going to do is we're going to structure that conversation and have it again here before you in order that you can hear the history of NORC and its future. For anyone educated in the empirical social sciences in the 1980s, or in my case, sort of slipping over to the 1990s, and has taught or conducted research, NORC represents sort of an iconic feature of the landscape. Frankly, the GSS still haunts my dreams, as I remember trying to emphasize the difference between a survey question that asks whether you disagree or agree with the statement, a job is okay, but women really just want a home and family. I think it's home and children, not family. And the theoretical concept of gender norms to 18-year-olds at 8 o'clock in the morning. I hate the GSS for that. NORC has evolved dramatically, and these two gentlemen, I think, fairly and magically illustrate the continuum and the continuity. Norman has made a lifelong commitment to the university and to the theoretical and pragmatic development of survey research. His co-authored books, Asking Questions and Thinking About Answers, saved my life more than once in teaching survey methodology to graduate students and undergraduates. Dan, conversely, has spent his career in the policy trenches of Washington, in and out of government, and fortunately with us now, bringing rigor, careful thought, and good data to bear on policy issues of the day. His enormous impact on the mix of our work is evidenced by the huge rise in evaluation work that we do. Their biographies are available in the symposium guidelines. I can't bring justice to them. So now you will be lucky enough to hear the historical continuum and perspective of these two people who've held the very same spot in different eras, but who share with us the custody of the past and the future of NORC and its commitment to high-quality data collection and research and service in the public interest. To help guide this conversation and to make sure we stay on time, we'll be focusing on 4 themes that Dan and Norman and I have been talking about for a little while. And I'll ask them a series of open-ended questions, and I'm assuming they'll have relatively unscripted answers. And I'll just give you a preview and then bring them up here. The first is we're going to talk about continuity and change, so how research and methods have changed or stayed the same over 75 years. How the history of research funding changed what we do and who we are. That means how has the political and social history of the U.S. transformed NORC? How the research that NORC does in all its form have been influenced by academic research and vice versa, applied research, or what we call research, a problem in search of research. and how NORC's history as a leader in data collection, measurement, and analysis will help us contribute to what's been dubbed the new data revolution. You know that thing, big data. The emergence of data analytics and all new forms of digital data. This is a revolution that's been championed by business and industry, and NORC's long history as a not-for-profit gives us a stake in this game, and we'll talk about that in the end, and Dan has some thoughts, as does Norman. So I'd like to invite them here to join me, and I will become Oprah. So we're going to start with the question, and the sound of my own voice is reverberating in my ears. We'll start with the question about, seriously reverberating. We're going to start about the history, and I'll start with a question for Norman, which is, can you sort of describe to me some of the substantive themes in NORC's research portfolio? So over the last 40 years, what's changed, what's been the same, how have our methods and approaches changed?
Okay, is this on?
Yeah.
Okay. Why is that?
That's me.
Okay. Oh, okay.
Our timing was on.
Sorry. Well, in a way, the themes, the subjects NORC studies have stayed, in a way, the same, but the relative balance changes over time, and some aspects of the subject. But we've been interested in, doing research on education, on healthcare, on issues of workforce, and the interrelationships between all of those. And of course, public opinion, not so much political public opinion, but public opinion related more to social issues. One of the things that I think is not fully appreciated by the NORC was founded, Harry Field actually came from marketing, but Clyde Hart was a sociologist. And the relationship of NORC to the university has been closer with sociology than it has with political science, whereas in Michigan, it's been closer with political science and to some extent psychology. And that has had a subtle influence, I think, on the time. When Bob Michael came in the, what was it, in the 80s, I think, we branched out to economics. We essentially had no relationship with economics. That, I think, was also a change in what economics was interested in, and the sort of importance of data about workforce and things like that. So over the years, sometimes it'd be almost all education, very little public health issues. So now health is big and education is somewhat smaller. Workforce issues have been there all along. And then occasionally some special social issue will come up. Well, I guess race relations in some sense has been a theme from very early days. It's taken different formats. We did a big study on integrated neighborhoods in the late 60s. Of course, the series on racial attitude, white attitude towards African Americans has gone back to the 40s, I think, when that actually started. So in a way, we've had a full portfolio all the time, but just emphasizing different things at different times.
So the balance has changed?
But the balance right now, I think, is more towards health, big. But it reflects, in a way, the changing agendas of the country.
Right.
And as those change, then the research interests change to different things, and we sort of shift with it.
So, Dan, what's the new toolkit? What's the new set of issues in this continuity and change?
So I'd just first like to say that if you think there's anybody who could do what Norman just did, except for Norman, you'd be wrong. That's one of the joys of working closely with Norman, is that he knows more about NORC than any 5 of us put together, and it's really a treat for all of us. I think Norman's right that the organization has always been dedicated to the range of human endeavor, the human experience. So that means that at any given time, we might be doing education work or health work or criminal justice work or work on population studies and finance or epidemiology or healthcare. And it will come and go as the public interest and the agenda and the funding streams change. But there are some constants. I think the scientific principles that have guided the organization through its entire history, scientific integrity, objectivity, transparency, collegiality, innovation, those have been a hallmark for NORC since its inception, and they continue today. Strong survey research has been a core part of what that's the basis on which we are founded. We continue to do that today. But in terms of what has changed, and I think has changed in a substantial way, let's say, is that we've expanded the repertoire. We've expanded the range of what the organization does, both in subject matters, I would say, Norman, even though you're right. One thing I love about talking with Norman is that when you name a subject, and Norman's not the only one, anybody who's been here a long time, you can often have a conversation where one of them will say to you, oh yeah, we did a study on that back in, and you really do get the sense that there is nothing new under the sun. But that said, in terms of the amount of time that we spend doing any one thing, you mentioned in your opening remarks, we are now very much considered a program evaluation powerhouse. And what's interesting about that to me is, I have enjoyed watching the definition change of what we consider our core expertise. So when I first got here 15 years ago, it was really a reach for us to do significant evaluation studies. And then as we started taking on a couple of them, that became very exciting, but that was the sort of occasional thing. And now it's very mainstream across all of our research departments. So now we actually don't talk about evaluation as the new capability and the new expertise that we're trying to continue and grow and develop. We are continuing to try and grow and develop it, but we now consider that part of the core expertise along with survey research. And similarly with policy analysis and some of the applied implementation work we do is all new. It's also worth pointing out that, both Dean Nierenberg and Dean Diermeyer mentioned that we're in 40 countries around the world. That certainly was not always the case. Our international group is only, I think, if I don't get this right, Jeff Telgarski, correct me, but I think it's maybe 8 or 10 years old. So the fact that in 10 years or less, we are now in 40 countries is a testament to the growth of the organization. And then in terms of subject matter, I think we have seen an explosion in the health work, but frankly, in every area, what we've tried to do is grow and expand beyond the core survey research expertise into more analytic and applied policy studies, and that's basically grown the subject matter expertise along with the technical skills.
So NORC is the home of the survey expert, is now evolving into the home of the survey plus evaluation expert, I suspect.
Yeah, plus data, now
data
we use the word
analytics.
data analytics. Everybody wants to use that word. It's very easy for us to use that word. We like to say we've been at the intersection of big data and big decisions for 75 years. But the way we've been at that intersection has been growing and expanding.
I always wanted to be a data scientist. Now I can be. How about that? So let's move on to how sort of the social world has affected us. Norman, when we spoke, I think the first time, you mentioned something that I didn't know, which is really interesting, which is that after World War II, I was going to say the war, but most of you would think of that as like Kuwait or something. That after World War II, that a lot of the federal government adopted the contracting mechanisms of the Defense Department, including health and social services. And that really changed how NORC
went about things, largely because the money was available. Maybe you could elaborate on that and sort of talk about how the history of funding transformed what we're doing.
Okay. Well, in originally, aside from during the Second World War, where the government was the major funder, something which was called the Office of Facts and Figures, which I've always thought it's a lovely name for a government agency. Then it became the Office of War Information, which was the sole client, essentially, of NORC at the time. But for about 10 or so years after the end of the war, big foundations, where the government didn't do much in the way of funding things, but most of the research in NORC was funded by big foundations. The Carnegie Foundation, something called the Health Information Foundation, and Ford when it got going. But the big change for all of us, I think, was the war on poverty. And the war on poverty did two big things, I think, for its in terms of social science, NORC, and first of all, it changed the contracting measure. Before, essentially, that there was no such thing as an RFP. In fact, I'd never heard the term until the latter part of the 60s and so forth. And this came about, as Felicia mentioned, when a bunch of people who were known as McNamara's Whiz Kids moved from the Defense Department into the Office of Economic Opportunity, as it was called at the time, and eventually that was absorbed into HEW. And they brought defense contracting methods to things. And the two big elements is, one, it was a contract, not a grant. And for a long, long time, academics didn't know the difference, and so we had to explain them. They
still don't.
Okay. But the intellectual difference was that whereas grants, we proposed topics, what's now called investigator-initiated research, and so forth. With the RFP, the research is defined more or less. Sometimes badly, sometimes not too badly, and a contract, a proposal, request for a proposal is issued, which describes what's wanted and so forth, and then various organizations that feel they can carry out that things will put in proposals. And what this did was create an industry. The applied social research industry, or the evaluation industry, as it's now sort of more things, really formed as a consequence of the war on poverty, because there's enormous sums of money were put into poverty programs, and they had attached to them some proportion. I think 5%, maybe, actually, I least thought it was 10%, but let's say 5%, had to be spent on evaluating the programs. And what this did was, first of all, provide an enormous pool of money, which, brought in for-profit firms. Sometimes they evolved out of a project. Mathematica research evolved as a company, at least in its now things, out of the New Jersey income tax experiment. And the Apt is, I always think, I don't know if people know who Clark Apt is anymore, but I think of Clark Apt as the person who actually invented the for-profit applied research firm in Cambridge, Mass. At the time. And he tried to buy NORC at one time, but we said no. We were interested in becoming a for-profit firm. So that changed the whole structure of the world, in a way, and it made it much more competitive. So NORC has had to learn how to be competitive, because when we started out, up until, I would say, until the late 60s or maybe even 70s, the only competitor to NORC was the Survey Research Center in Michigan, basically.
And even then, not so much.
And well,
I know Bill Axon is sitting around here somewhere.
Well, I mean, in a way, that's true. But if, you might say because we divided the market, they did political science and some psycho. The mental health was one of the areas where we actually overlapped, kind of in a way. But by and large, we did different sort of things than the Michigan people did. But that all changed, and as I say, it grew enormously. And evaluation research was invented, I mean, as a field. I mean, I was an early member of what's the Evaluation Research Society, which got started, I think, in the 70s or something like that. And that was a concept that when I was in graduate school, or even 10 years after that, nobody ever talked about it. Now it's, big thing.
Well, Norman, I'm sure there are plenty of people in this room who wish they didn't know the word RFP either. It ruins our lives.
That's right.
So, Dan, as federal budgets tighten, in our traditional, I hate the word sweet spot, but our traditional sweet spot of large surveys disappears. How has NORC's funding portfolio changed? I know we have some new initiatives that we're sort of returning to the days of us initiating. I know that.
Felicia,
Yep.
turn it on, please.
That AmeriSpeak and our platform for real estate modeling is new to us. Can you tell us a little bit about how, as the funding models have changed, how NORC has changed its approach?
Yeah, sure. It's interesting listening to Norman talk about how NORC had to learn how to be competitive, and I'm sure it must have been interesting in the time when we didn't. We write a lot of proposals at NORC. We write over 400 a year at last count, and recently I got a sort of pro bono consult from a Boston consulting group guru, and we were just talking over coffee at a small place in Boston, and he said, "Let me understand this. You spend $7 million a year, and you win $450 million in business with that $7 million, and you're asking me how to grow the business." And I said, "Yeah," and he said, "I think you should spend more than $7 million. So I think we've learned really well how to be competitive, but it is a really competitive world out there. And it's true, to pick up on your question, that surveys, truthfully, we don't yet now see what we all believe we will see, which is an impending squeeze on surveys. It is true that the frequency with which the government or anyone launches a new large-scale survey initiative has diminished. But in terms of sort of the existing stock of large-scale survey research that we do, and I mean, people could argue with this at the margins, but for the most part, it continues to be alive and well. And we continue to do that work, and we continue to do that work well and to really enjoy doing it. And it is still a huge part of the information infrastructure of the United States. Without these surveys, major decisions that our policymakers and that our federal, state, and local staff use to run programs could not be made. That said, there is this new, there's a great pressure on federal budgets. Surveys are expensive. There is an increasingly vociferous group of voices saying that new and emerging types of data, and even older existing types of found data, if you will, as opposed to design data, which is, again, sometimes how people distinguish between survey data versus administrative data sources, will, by necessity, need to take to the fore. And that surveys will go into decline. And so that's part of the reason why we are always trying to expand the repertoire. What I think we will see is that instead of this stark dichotomy of surveys, no good, passe, old, too expensive. Administrative data, big data, good, wonderful. Is that what we're going to see is that these data sources each have limitations and strengths and weaknesses, and they are going to be better together than they are as a single thing. And so what NORC has spent a lot of time working on is the whole notion of how do you create linkages and data harmonization and ways to use these different types of data together so that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And so the kind of work that we're doing is supportive of the full data to knowledge continuum. So yes, we've built Amerispeak, which becomes state-of-the-art data collection, what we believe is the most rigorous and effective online research platform that exists today. But frankly, that's our traditional business. That's survey research. But then you need mechanisms and platforms for creating those linkages and creating access for research expertise to data. So that's our data enclave. The data enclave becomes a data management tool and a data access tool. And then, on the next part of the continuum, you need to make sure that you have really effective data dissemination. Again, data of all types. So that would mean our tools like the GSS Data Explorer, which Felicia is the chief architect of, and is one of our best examples of how to do really good data dissemination in the 21st century. Or in a different way, another one of our new initiatives, the AP/NORC Center, that has a old roots in terms of opinion research piece to it, but it also is state-of-the-art dissemination for NORC because we amplify our reach through the world's largest megaphone, the Associated Press. So I think what we're doing is investing in tools and capabilities and know-how that allow us to work with data of all types, to put them together, and to use them in better ways.
So like my retirement portfolio, we're diversifying, right?
That's the plan.
Great. And maybe I can retire.
But for the trustees sitting in the room, past performance is no guarantee of future results.
I hope that's not true of my retirement portfolio. So one of the things we talked about, the three of us talked about, that I found really interesting, and because some of our friends are here from Michigan, let's have this conversation. We've talked about the tight and the loose linkage between academic research and research that's driven more by the policy interests or public interests, and that the model that NORC followed was a model in part of separation. We still have an affiliation. We still do academically driven research, but it's a much less tight connection than, for instance, our friends at Michigan at the Survey Research Center. I wonder, Norman, if you can talk about the history of that and how you think the relationship occurred in the history of NORC, and then a little bit about your understanding of where we might go, and then we'll get Dan to weigh in as well.
Well, its history really is from the very beginning of the two organizations and the way they're structured. The NORC is a separate, independent 501c3 corporation. It existed before it came to the University of Chicago. As Nirenberg mentioned, he's a good historian. He found out how it came about, and the backstory, in case it was that the Marshall Field, who was both the trustee of the university and the donor for NORC, it was founded by the Field Foundation. When Harry Field was killed, he went to the president of the university, Hutchins, and said, "What should I do with this organization that I founded?" And Hutchins went to Ralph Tyler, and as Ralph told me, I said, "Well, bring it to the University of Chicago, of course." And so it came and was affiliated. So it stayed as an independent organization and affiliated with the university. And there's a one-page, actually, affiliation agreement. At least then, I gathered. Michigan, on the other hand, or the Survey Research Center in Michigan, is an integral part of the university. And that means that all the money flows through the university, and all of the university policies apply to us. So that has to do with what kind of research you can do, what kind of publications you can do, and so forth. And also Michigan, the University of Michigan is a much bigger university, so they've been able to have faculty positions in ISR. And when there's downtime, they sell essentially faculty time to the university. So there's a much a bigger need in a way for teaching in Michigan than in Chicago. So Chicago's always our problem, now the NORC side, has always been that the university, that the social science division and the other parts, the business school. I was actually from the business school. Aren't very big, at least they're bigger now than they were. And so there was always a reluctance on the part of the departments to have too many of their faculty associated with NORC, for the fear that somehow or other the NORC faculty-related people would dominate the department. So when I wanted to build up the faculty sort of things, I had to diversify, to bring in economists and bring in political scientists in order to, and a few from the business school. But and now with the Harris School, which we didn't have at that time, it gives us another sort of things. But the scale, it's the two things are the independence of the structural of the organization and the size of the universities. I think are the two
That's an interesting evolution. Having been at both places, I can't. I don't know which is a better model, but being too large and the takeover of NORC at the University of Chicago kind of makes me happy. See the little army of NORC colonizing the University of Chicago.
And vice versa.
And I'll leave that imagery with you all.
We're happy to be invaded.
Just bring tents. And so I think the question for you then, Dan, is what's the evolution going forward? You know, I think the types of research we do, the environment we do it in has changed so much. I mean, you know, if the former head of NIMH is going to Google, we know we're not in Kansas anymore, right? And so what do you think the evolution of NORC as an independent affiliate, what mix of research are we going to be doing? What's the future of our employment going to look like?
Yeah, I've got a crystal ball right here.
I'm looking in it.
You know, I think there's a natural blurring of the lines that's occurring, and we talked about this in our other conversation among the disciplines. You mentioned how you always wanted to be a data scientist. You know, one of my favorite definitions of a data scientist is they're a better programmer than a statistician and a better statistician than a programmer. And, you know, that's tongue-in-cheek, of course, but the point is, I think that one of NORC's hallmarks has always been flexibility and adaptability. And what we're going to see is, even as we remain part of the academic community and very closely tied to one of its, you know, hallmark organizations, the University of Chicago, all of us, but particularly applied research organizations like NORC, are going to need to be more accepting of these blurred lines and more willing to say that a pure disciplinary approach to one thing or another can be sacrificed on the altar of doing really good applied research. And that, you know, frankly, sometimes the data scientists who may not be as versed in statistics as a statistician and may not be as good a programmer as a programmer, but who have unique insights into how to look at a complex and unusual data set that's being created by a digital source, are going to be really valuable to us delivering solutions to our funders and clients. So, I mean, I think that's the answer from a business standpoint. In terms of the relationship with the university and so forth, I mean, I don't, while I see that as being a dynamic relationship and one that's always, you know, changing and developing, I don't see in its fundamentals that it changes at all. Because, you know, what makes NORC unique is its relationship to the university, and that how that embodies who we are. Again, it's these core principles. I hate to sound like a broken record, but scientific integrity, objectivity, excellence, collegiality, innovation, those are all sort of part of our academic roots. That's what we gain from being part of such a vibrant academic community. And I just, I think we will always draw strength on that. We will always, sort of be nurtured in effect by the university. And of course, as David mentioned, our trustees, our most senior leadership derives from the university. So that's a nice constant for us in a dynamic world that's always changing.
That was a great answer. I feel like cheering now. So we're going to just end. I'm cognizant of the time with a question about the future. And I think for all of us in the data business, the specter of big data, which as all of us who have been doing data things for many years, I have no idea what that means, and nor will I define it. But I think I'm really interested in a historical perspective on the evolution of data and its it becoming big, and what NORC's role has been. And I'll ask Norman that, and then Dan, I won't ask you another question. I'll just ask you to tell us how NORC can intervene in the world of big data, or become the world of big data, or transform me into a data scientist, because the Harvard Business Review has said it is the sexiest job title ever, and I would like it. So, Norman, I'll let you go first, and then Dan.
Actually, I want to do a new item.
Go for it.
A challenge for us, which, and that is one of the strengths we hadn't mentioned about NORC's relation with the university is the students and the training that students get at NORC and so forth. And one of the challenges, as NORC has gotten bigger and is spread out more, is the students' relationship shouldn't only be in Chicago. The question is, can students work on projects in Washington or San Francisco or Boston? And that's a real kind of challenge I think we have. NYC is a big hirer, as said this morning. We hire a lot of students from the university, particularly the Harris School. But I think that's a big challenge for educational institutions as to how to give students a bigger geographical scope as well. On the size thing, we've just grown. I mean, the first study I worked on was the biggest at NORC at the time. It had a sample of 30,000 people, and we processed everything on IBM cards. It was a big challenge. But we've grown, so, as the field said. So, 10,000 was a great challenge at one point. Now it's kind of routine. I think that the immunization study screens 100,000 households a month or something like that.
Yeah, I was wondering what your denominator was. Yes.
100,000
millions of calls a year.
Yeah, so it's grown, and there are only a few places that, in that sense, the competition for big data collection. There are only a couple of other places that have grown along with it. In a way, I was surprised to discover a few years ago that the Census Bureau views us as a competitor, as does WestEd and so forth. So we've just grown with those kind of challenges, and it's scaled up. And I'm sure on all these others, with the size of the data enclave growing, it's going to have a big issue of scope there. America Speak seems to be off and running, and God knows how big that'll get. And anyway, that's one of the great strengths of NORC is its adaptability and its ability to learn and innovate, move ahead.
And Dan, the last word?
Yeah, so, this perhaps makes me sound like, an old guy. But my colleagues and I at NORC tend to say data is data. And, you know, there are, as I said before, there are different kinds of data, it takes different forms, but there are always going to be problems, limitations, issues with any data, whether it's an enormous data set or it's a small data set, whether it's design data, or whether it's found data. And so our role is to, again, sticking to those principles, which I will spare you from hearing for the fourth time, and nobody put me up to this, but it's amazing how they do resonate in answering these questions, is to be true to those principles and to advocate for them as the world changes. I think as the world is facing pressure and is increasingly uncertain because of the explosion of data, the volume of data, that there is all kinds of pressure to do really cool stuff better, faster, cheaper, more effectively. And, you know, what we all know is that it's not that simple. You know, there's a lot of claims out there about how predictive analytics are going to solve all of the world's problems. And those of us who are used to working with messy data, who have, you know, had our arms, you know, elbow deep in messy data, know that there's no such thing in a free lunch in data as in anything else. And so I think one of our key roles, one of our key leadership roles is, you know, without sounding like we're poo-pooing the value and importance of this incredibly new and rich data that's being generated every day by these mobile devices and everything else, that we sound this consistent note that says, look, you have to be careful, you have to be objective, you have to be transparent, you know, you can't rush to results, you have to use good science, you have to make sure that peers have weighed in on it. You know, all the things that we've learned over 75 years and really the whole 20th century apply in the 21st century with use of data. And the techniques and the tools and the know-how, it's all developing and it's very exciting. But again, these constants are going to be essential. And we have, I think, a unique leadership role to sound that note while still being enthusiasts.
Look at the clock.
And we're good. And I want to thank you very much for the conversation. We're going to be taking it on the road if you want to see us, you know. And thank you very much.